Well, welcome to the midterms. You guys have gotten through the first few weeks of class. You've read in your Hicks book. You should be just about finishing up in the Sire book, gearing up for the Holmes book. It's all starting to really make sense, right? So what we're going to talk about today are two men. So Saint Anselm of Canterbury and Saint Thomas Aquinas. Now both of these are Catholic theologians in the Middle Ages or the medieval period, and both of them are important for both theological reasons but also for philosophical reasons. So let's really break these down. So Anselm of Canterbury was born in 1033 and lived until 1109. He was a wandering scholar at the monastery in Bec, which is in France. He became a monk at the age of 27, eventually becoming the principal teacher there at that monastery. Now, he wrote multiple books, but two of the most important for our purposes anyway are Monologion and Proslogion. So in Monologion, listen to what he writes. He says, anyone should be able to convince himself of the existence of God through reason alone if he is even moderately intelligent. He says, if you're even moderately intelligent, you should be able to convince yourself that there's a God. And I think he's drawing some from Psalm 14:1 that says what? That says, the fool in his heart says there is no God. So it's only the fool that says there's no God. So if you're even moderately intelligent, that's probably you. If you're even moderately intelligent, you should be able to convince yourself and realize that God exists. And so his Monologion is kind of the groundwork of his instruction. But then he doesn't feel like it suffices. He doesn't feel like it's enough. And so what he does is he then turns around and writes Proslogion. And Proslogion provides what's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. And so let's try and break this down for just a second. He argues that God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. So his definition of God is that nothing greater can possibly exist. That is his presuppositional position, that God equals nothing else is greater than. Nothing greater can even be imagined or considered or thought, okay? So the greatest possible being must be God. So then he says that it's greater to exist in reality than it is in the mind. Right? So it would be better if I can imagine the world's most perfect taco. It would be better for me to be able to hold that taco and that taco actually exist than for it only to exist in my mind. Or maybe even better, it would be better for that taco to exist even if it existed somewhere that I couldn't access it. That would be better than if I could only imagine it. So he says that it's greater to exist in reality than it is in the mind. He says if something exists in the mind, you can actually think of something greater than that thing because you can imagine or think of that thing actually existing. So the greatest possible taco is not the taco that I can think of, because it would be greater for it to exist than for it not to exist. You see where I'm going? And so he says then, therefore, God exists. Because an existing God would be better than a hypothetical God, because he can imagine and envision in his head the greatest possible being, perfect, holy, righteous, good, sovereign, powerful. He can imagine all of those things. And the only thing better than the God that he can imagine is if that God were to exist in reality. And since God is the greatest thing of which nothing greater can be imagined, God therefore must exist. Now, why is that important? That seems like a weird argument. Why is that important? Frankly, it's still in use today. Christian apologists who who converse with the modern atheist movement and who have conversations with other philosophers, they still use this argument. All the way penned back by Anselm of Canterbury in Proslogion. Now, just a personal word, my favorite work that he's written is called Cur Deus Homo, Why the God-Man. And in that, every Christmas I like to go back and reread it. Because as I reread Cur Deus Homo, Why the God-Man, I'm reminded again the importance of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Now, that may not be particularly relevant in philosophy, but in terms of the scope of his thought, the breadth of his thought, he's going so far as to discuss why God is the greatest thing, because you can't imagine anything greater. And he's explaining that in order to pay the penalty of sin, the second person of the triune Godhead clothed himself in flesh, wrapped himself in humanity, and came and substituted himself for sinners on a cross. It's incredible. And so while we're here, let's talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, he comes just after Anselm. So Aquinas is born in 1224 and he dies in 1274. Now, the reason Aquinas is important in philosophy is there had always kind of existed this invisible barrier that between faith and reason, between theology and philosophy. You see, for Aquinas, before Aquinas, it was either you did the work of a theologian and you assumed the existence of God, or you did the work of philosophy and you perhaps argued over the reason of God. You at least took that into consideration as you built and developed a philosophy. But one of Aquinas' greatest feats is that he combines those two disciplines. He combines faith and reason, and he kind of integrates it into, depending on how you read him, a philosophical theology, or at the very least, a theological philosophy. So, what to know about Aquinas? Aquinas was educated in a Benedictine school. So if you're familiar at all with Roman Catholicism and the different monastic orders, there's the Franciscan monks, there's the Benedictine monks, so there's the Dominican monks. So he was educated in a Benedictine school, and as he studied philosophy, he was heavily influenced by Aristotle. Now that's important to know because, as you've read in the Hicks book, before Aquinas comes onto the scene, really most Christian theology being done and Christian philosophy was being done in a Neoplatonic mindset, following the teachings of those who followed Plato. They just kind of assumed that Aristotle was with them since Aristotle was Plato's student. But Aquinas comes across Aristotle and recognizes something vastly different. Now, what he does is, despite the fact that he was educated in a Benedictine school, he became a Dominican monk. Now, this kind of resulted in a whirlwind of activities. He gets kidnapped by his family for a year when they found out. He was held captive. They tried to deprogram him for a year to change his mind and to turn him toward the right monastic order. It's bonkers. He earns a doctorate after they finally release him. He earns a doctorate at the University of Paris. And it's interesting as we look back on him, because while he was a student, he was quiet. He was very subdued and reserved. And so they actually just thought he wasn't all that sharp, which is fascinating when you look back at history, because he's considered one of the towering figures in theology and philosophy, and they just thought he wasn't that bright because he was quiet. It's amazing. His teacher said that, and his peers called him a dumb ox, that they could not imagine him being anything more than a dumb ox. He was just a big guy who wasn't all that bright. And then he wrote, and they were blown away. He was a major figure that dominates Catholic theology for the next 8 900 years, for the next 800 years at least. He is a dominating figure. I know my math wasn't right. It's definitely 7 to 800, not 8 to 900. Don't add up the years, otherwise he's still dominating in the future. That may be, but I don't have a prophetic gift, so I'm pretty sure that's not what that was. So he dominates Catholic theology for centuries, and the two books that I want you to know that he wrote were the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles. So both of these are called the Summas, right? So the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles. In the Summa Theologica, he wrote, it was a philosophical writing, and in it, that's when he does his major work, his yeoman's work of combining theology and philosophy. And then he wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles as the follow-up to that. So anytime you get asked the question as to who wrote a book, if it has Summa in the title, at least for the purposes of this class, you can assume it was Thomas Aquinas. Now, because you're patient and long-suffering, let's review a couple of items that are going to be on your midterms that I want you to know. I want you to do well on this thing, okay? So there are 4 major branches of philosophy. 4 major branches of philosophy. You need to know the branches and the questions they ask. So, for instance, ethics is a branch of philosophy, and the question that ethics asks is, what is good? So ethics, what is good? Then you have metaphysics, and the question that metaphysics asks is, what is real? So you have ethics, what is good? You have metaphysics, what is real? The third branch is aesthetics, and the question that's asked in aesthetics is, what is beautiful? So let's go back. You have ethics, what is good? Metaphysics, which is what is real, aesthetics, what is beautiful, and then the fourth is epistemology. Epistemology. And epistemology asks the question, what is true? Okay, so you need to know each of those 4 branches and the questions that they're asking. You also need to be sure that you remember and recall the various pre-Socratic thinkers and what element they believe to be the fundamental element of the universe. I'm not going to go over that here. We've gone over that in another video. Be sure you go back and rewatch these videos. Be sure you go back and look at those PowerPoints again. You need to remember the pre-Socratic thinkers and the elements they believed were the most fundamental. And then there are a few quotes that you want to be sure you know who's saying what, right? So you need to know that it was Heraclitus that made the profound statement that bothers every freshman level philosophy student, where he says that you cannot step in the same river twice. You need to know that it was Socrates who said the unexamined life is simply not worth living. You need to know that it was Aristotle who said that virtue is a habit. And you need to know that it was Augustine who said in his Confessions, praying to God, you have made us for yourself, and our soul does not rest until it rests in you. Each of those are important quotations to understand and remember the emphases of those philosophers. Okay? I'm rooting for you. Do a good job. Do not stress out. Breathe. Breathe in, breathe out. You've got it nailed. I'll see you next week.